This course is a partnership between the Global Awareness Education at the University of Tübingen in Germany and the Federal University of ABC in Brazil. In this course, we will address various perspectives on the topic, such as challenges faced by big cities, sustainable cities, migration, and health issues. We will have guests from different countries and contexts to contribute with lectures, which will be interspersed with more practical classes in which students will do case studies on Latin American, African, and Asian big cities. In both universities, the course is offered to students of different disciplines, in Tübingen as part of the Transdisciplinary Course Program, and at the Federal University of ABC as a free extension course. The course organizers are Professor Gilberto Rodrigues, Federal University of ABC, and me, Glaucia Peres da Silva, University of Tübingen. Today, we will hear a lecture on global challenges to metropolises with Professor Klaus Frey from the Federal University of ABC with the title Governing Metropolises in View of Climate Change and Other Global Wicked Problems. I would like to invite Professor Gilberto Rodrigues to present our guest.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gilberto Rodrigues. I am Associate Professor of the Federal University of ABC and co-host with my colleague, Dr. Glaucia Peres, of this course. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Klaus Frey, who is full professor in the area of public policies at the Federal University of ABC. Professor Klaus holds a Master in Science of Administration and a PhD in Social Science from the University Konstanz in Germany. He also did a postdoc studies at the Technological University of Berlin, also in Germany. So he also is a researcher at the National Council for Technological Development in Brazil. He has published extensively in public policies, and he is a reference in this field in Brazil. So it's a great pleasure, my colleague Klaus Frey, to introduce to you, and I give you the floor for your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Gilberto. And also I would like to thank Glaucia for the invitation to take part in this very interesting course that you have organized here. And I think it's a very great opportunity also to strengthen the relation between the universities of Tübingen and our university in São Paulo in Brazil. And also in general, the cooperation between Brazil and Germany. I think that's really a very important initiative. So I'm very happy to join you this night, or it depends where you will be now, night or afternoon. And so we can start talking more about the role of cities in global governance. And I will first of all share the screen with you. So let's see. I hope it works. Can you see the presentation? Okay, fine. So the topic of my presentation today is governing metropolises in view of climate change and other global wicked problems. And first of all, I think it's important to recognize that cities, huge metropolis as São Paulo, where I'm coming from, are facing very variegated problems, wicked problems, problems with very difficult solutions, because they involve many interests, many different views, many different problems. And therefore, there is an increasing literature on wicked problems, especially in the field of public policies. So the idea, how can we handle these kind of complex problems that not only cities, but that governments are facing in general. So I hope it goes on. It didn't here, page down. Oh, okay. So first of all, do you see the next slide, the summary? So I would like to give you a very brief overview of my talk tonight. First of all, I will give you some ideas about the complexity of urban crises that we are facing in the major metropolises. I will maybe from a specific perspective of the Global South. However, I think many of the ideas and concepts that we will discuss today, they apply, I would say, also for metropolises in the Global North, but my perspective is definitely more from the experiences of the Global South and maybe specifically from Brazil. So I will then go over to present some theoretical conceptual approaches related to the challenge of governing metropolises in the context of these of crisis and of complex problems that these cities have to face and to solve in a certain extent. So specifically, I will highlight different concepts of governance, of environmental governance, but also in general, how institutional structures can and should help in order to handle these kind of complex problems that we increasingly will face also in the future. And I will give you some more concrete ideas about water governance in the metropolis of São Paulo, taking into consideration a recent crisis, water crisis that we have faced in 2014, 2015, and the effects that it had on the governance practices in the city or in the metropolitan region of São Paulo. And I will conclude with some general ideas on a perspective of sustainable strategies for metropolises, let's say, in the Global South. So some introductory ideas about crisis. I would first of all highlight that it seems that we are in a very peculiar condition currently in the world, I think, where we are facing multiple crises. It's evident now the recent crisis on COVID-19 that we all suffered and had very strong consequences on people itself, but also on cities, on how to handle this kind of crisis that had a very strong impact on the ways how people live in the city, on the economic practices in the cities, and so on. But I think it's very important to recognize that these crises or specific crises used to have effects also on other policy fields and very often trigger crises also in other fields of development. So evidently, and this is an ongoing problem, is the climate crisis, climate change as a very specific and very peculiar challenge, because it's a long-term problem that we will face in the next decades, but also other problems related to the ecological crisis, for instance, in terms of biodiversity, the water, the problems related to water scarcity, or also to extreme events of rain that we are facing and we have faced in many countries more recently, and all kind of pollutions, pollution of the air, of the soil, and basically of water as well. And it was very important also to highlight that ecological problems and ecological crises, they used to affect people in different degrees, and that already existing conditions of inequality that we have in many of these metropolises that are still more stronger due to these kind of ecological challenges. So, and not only ecological, also the COVID crisis definitely had effects much more severe in those regions, in those areas of the city where we do not have a very good infrastructure, basic sanitation infrastructure and so on, where people are living in very dense conditions, very strongly populated areas, and therefore a very strong difficulty to protect themselves against the virus. And therefore we see that these different crises used to enforce other already existing crises. Today we are facing also the war of the Ukraine war, but wars, it's not an exception. When we look in the global south, we have in several regions, we have also after the Second World War, we have faced several wars that led people to flee from their territories, from their cities, from their region where they have lived, going to other cities, increasing the cities, contributing to the growth of the cities, and therefore always also in increasing problems related to violence, to poverty, and so on. So the migration problem is also a consequence of wars, of violence, of poverty, but also of environmental problems that the people are facing on the countryside or in other municipalities, in other regions, and they're trying to flee from these unsustainable conditions and very often go to the major metropolises and creating additional problems to face this kind of complexity and to handle this complexity from part of the local governments. And evidently also an economic and fiscal crisis also goes hand in hand with this kind of crisis. The COVID-19 condition, for instance, when we look now what is happening in China more recently with the total lockdown in cities like Shanghai that had extreme consequences for the people, for the restrictions of their basic liberties on the one hand, but also have very strong consequences for economic activities in the concrete cities, but also in that case also globally, having influence on global economic relations, on globalization in general. And all these kind of crisis, they also lead to more complicated situations related to the state himself, for democracy and governance in general. And this will be the focus of my talk tonight. So maybe you have accompanied me more recently. There have been many books published about the death of democracy, that there are attacks, that political legitimacy of liberal democracy is diminishing, and therefore it's very evident that it's also a political crisis that is related to these transformations that the cities, the major metropolis are experiences currently. So concluding in that sense, we can say that urban governance or metropolitan governance seems always more characterized by continuous crisis management, by continuous and very often also more authoritarian forms of crisis management to deal with constantly shifting wicked problems. What could be conceived maybe as the new normal. So one first question is, to what extent this is becoming not an exception, this kind of crisis, but that cities in the current condition, let's say the current urban condition, it seems to be confronted with a situation where governments and mayors, I remember some weeks ago, I have assisted an interview with a mayor, I think it was from the city of Leipzig in Germany, who said, well, he as a mayor is nowadays always doing crisis management, and there is not even left much time for thinking in the long term to plan the city as we usually did in the past. So this does mean that governance seems changing in a very fundamental way. Well, but what is specific with the cities of the Global South? First of all, I would like to say that when we're looking at urban governance in the Global South, we have on the one hand old problems that are unresolved, basic infrastructure, basic sanitation infrastructure, the public transport system, the street system, and so on. All these issues that need still much resources also to canalize to solve these kind of problems. And in addition, we are facing these new problems, these new wicked problems, climate change, where we still do not know what will be the effects for the cities. We already have an idea about that because we already experienced in the last times this kind of variability of climate in the cities, and we know that the consequences might be very, very severe for the cities, but also other problems related to violence in general, related to the transformation of the labor market, for instance, where we might also come to a situation where certain areas and certain qualification will be superfluous in the future and will not be needed anymore by the capitalist system. So these changes are very unsecure, and therefore we are leading with insecurity and with risks. That seems a common feature of urban governance and urban governance in the Global South in the future. So we are facing a kind of dynamic interaction between urban growth, and in many parts of the world, we still have this kind of urban growth, especially in Africa or in Southeast Asia, but even in some cities in Latin America, there is still some urban growth on the way. And this is interacting with social conflict, social political conflicts, and also environmental stressors. And this is a kind of very explosive condition, I would say, and a very fundamental challenge for urban and metropolitan governance. In this context, it's certainly very important to highlight this trend to more neoliberal policies of privatization of public services. What very often we can say that maybe there had also some positive effects in terms of improvement of certain services, but in general, a tendency is the elevation of costs, especially for the urban poor, and the withdrawing of service delivery from the political public agenda. That means that many problems that have been traditionally dealt with within the democratic institutional structure, nowadays they are withdrawn from the political arena, and we have therefore a kind of process of depoliticization that we are facing always more, and therefore also a kind of reduction of democratic practices in these cities and metropolises. Then we have also when we looked at, especially from the 90s onwards in Brazil, but also in many other countries where we had this process of transition from military regimes to democratic liberal democracies, we have had the introduction of participatory approaches, and that these approaches are increasingly undermined by authoritarian and managerial approaches to governance. So therefore, we, at least in Brazil, we experience this very strongly, that these experiences of participation that have been very important to improve also the social living condition for the people in the cities are losing effectiveness nowadays due to the expansion of more managerial approaches in public administration and in governance in general. So I would like to present to you some basic theoretical concepts or approaches that are relevant and important in order to better understand what's going on currently in these major cities, but also where we find some, let's say, some concepts that should present ways how to come to more sustainable forms of development. So first of all, we have basically initiatives on the level of global governance. So the new urban agenda, for instance, proposed and by UN Habitat, or the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Sustainable Development Goals, very wide-ranging goals that could at least and should guide political action, should guide governance in not only in cities, but also definitely also in cities and metropolises. But from a more analytical perspective, there are other important concepts, theoretical concepts, like, for instance, the urban political ecology approach that starts from the idea that urbanization is a political process of socio-ecological change. That means that it is a dynamic, interconnected process of socio-metabolic transformation. What does this mean? This means that we need to have a more holistic perspective and a holistic view on the complexity of the cities. However, having in mind that the politics dimension is essential for socio-ecological change, for socio-ecological transformation. The similarities exist certainly in the urban sustainability transition movements, where there is also a focus on the challenges for governance and public policy making. It starts on the one hand from a diagnosis that cities, quoting here Nevens et al., that cities are the locations where most of the unsustainability issues find their origin. That means that many problems that we are facing in the fields of the environment, but also basically in the environment related, for instance, to climate change, they are produced, let's say, in cities. So cities are, on the one hand, the source of our problems, but at the same time, they are the spheres or the places where changes can and have to occur. So they are also the primordial spaces of innovation, of creativity. We have there the universities, we have all these agencies where this kind of creative thinking can occur, critical reflections, innovations, social mobilization and political struggles. So all political struggles that ended up in more significant change have traditionally been started in cities, in the major cities. And therefore, there is some hope that cities also can be the space for future transformation. More from the field of policy science or from public policy, there is an important concept of policy integration. So the idea that, and this is also related to the concept of urban political ecology, that in order to insert the concerns, for instance, with the environment or with public health, that these issues have to be integrated in all the different kinds of policies that have to be, or that used to be implemented in cities or in other governmental spheres. So quoting Tosun and Lang, they say that it is clear that the concept of policy integration plays a special role in debates on how to confront global challenges such as the promotion of public health. And we can add also the promotion of a sound environment. So the idea is that, and this is a challenge for public policies, how to integrate these specific concerns like a sound environment, like the mitigation or the adaptation to climate change, how these issues can be integrated in the different policy fields in education, in public health, in social assistance, in infrastructure policies, and so forth. Another concept is related to governance, environmental governance that used to be highlighted, or it used to be highlighted, the centrality of more participative or cooperative forms of governance. Quoting Lemus and Agrawal, they define environmental governance in the following terms. It's interventions aiming at changes in environment-related incentive, knowledge, institutions, decision-making, and behaviors. So the challenge for environmental governance is wide-reaching. We have to think about the adequate incentives to favor environmental issue. We have to invest in knowledge creation, in institutions that are able to handle these kind of problems. We have to think about how environmental issues will have better conditions to be considered in decision-making processes, and how we can influence in the end the consumers, but also other public agents, private agents in their behavior so that this behavior becomes more sustainable. So fundamental challenge for environmental governance and public policies. The authors continue to highlight the importance of a set of regulatory processes, of mechanisms and organizations through which political actors influence environmental actions and outcome. So the fundamental idea is that the fundamental actors must be the political actors, and they have to have an institutional framework, mechanisms that allow them to bring the environmental issues forward in the public agenda in general terms. Well, so I would like to present you a kind of definition of governance. I think governance is a fundamental concept, has gained much attention in the last decades. Very often, let's say, a more economic perspective, but I would like to suggest this kind of definition as a kind of working definition for thinking about governance. So we can define governance or governance practices that are characterized by the interplay of different actors, of different stakeholders, very often with different and conflictive antagonistic interests, views, and values. This is already a very important aspect, that governance is not, let's say, a harmonious form of coming to a common, to solve problems collectively, but we have to accept that that conflicts are a very characteristic feature of governance practices, which governance is supposed to bring into accordance or reconcile, resorting thereby to governance mechanisms, to rules able to regulate and intermediate negotiation processes, which allow to arrive at a common understanding on the problems. That's the first big problems. We know that in many areas, for instance, the coronavirus, the pandemic, or climate change, there is a very wide-ranging understanding about the problem. However, there are still relevant voices that are denying the existence of the problems, and they are very resistant in order to face this kind of problem. So we have to arrive at this common understanding of the problem, but also at possible strategies to overcome these problems. So importance of governance mechanisms that gives, let's say, the framework, the overall structure within which these negotiation processes can take place in order to overcome the problems. Definitely, this is a quite complicated endeavor, especially when the interests and values or the views are very different from the people that are involved in the problems, in the solution of the problems. So we can also identify different governance patterns or different concepts also of governance. One important concept that have been very influential in the debate is the concept of multi-level governance. It emerged in the context of the European Union, where we in fact could identify much more or increasing forms of cooperation between the European level, the national states, but also regional actors like the states on the subnational level, or even cities. So we find that there are cooperation is taking place between these different levels and different scales, and are therefore demonstrating, let's say, these kind of multi-level governance, where the focus is much more on the interfaces between the different levels. So this is an approach or a theory on multi-level governance that emerged in the field of political and of administrative science. And it was the result of looking at how organizational structures have changed just in view of this new complexity of the problems that we are traditionally facing in these contexts. So more interactive practices that demonstrate, in fact, the relevance of these intergovernmental relations, of the strengthening of this kind of multi-level governance. Another approach with some similarity is the concept of polycentric governance. And this concept confronts, let's say, the usual argument, very strong amongst urban planners, that action by centralized governments and planning by centralized governance tends to be more effective, and the existence of a more of a wider structure of actors, of institution, is much more a sign of fragmentation, and then also for a lack of effective governing, let's say. However, there have been done much research on this issue, very important, the so-called Ostrom School in Bloomington in the United States, guided by Eleanor Ostrom, who says that, well, that these kind of, that there exists alternative ways of tackling especially common pool resources in a more collaborative manner. So Ostrom will say, and that the research indicate that, especially on the more communitarian level, that there are possibilities to self-organization, that people, especially when there is when there are relations of trust between the people and there is social capital available, that people are able to self-organize themselves, and being therefore able to elaborate their own sets of rules and regulation, and thus define how such resources can be used for their common benefit. So that's the kind of argument that we do not need necessarily the state, the sovereign state, to regulate the conditions and the cooperation conditions for the people, but people themselves, communities themselves, are able to self-organize them and tackle complex problems like how to handle common pool resources, how to manage these common pool resources in a collective manner. And additional advantages of these approaches is that that power in these polycentric structures used to be more distributed, and therefore we have an institutional diversity that also will contribute to institutional resilience, to an enhanced capacity to lead, especially with changing conditions. So also to better face conflicts, to better face crisis in cities or in other contexts. But the main question is to what extent these experiences, where the focus was on the community level, can be transferred also to metropolitan regions or to metropolises. And therefore we have this quite huge, also important research that have been done on the importance of network governance, so that networks could be an effective form substituting, let's say, the more hierarchical traditional forms of planning and of public policy making. However, looking again on the conditions of the global South, taking into consideration that both concepts have been developed in the global North, do we have to go beyond these approaches on multi-level governance and polycentric governance? First of all, we have to take into consideration that in the global South, in the metropolises of the global South, we are facing extreme asymmetrical power relations. At least extremer than in the global North. So there is little hope, little reason for hope that more radical transformational change could arise from governmentally promoted participatory practices alone. This does not mean that state action will be very important in this process. However, we have to look also and much more to what happens beyond the institutional structures. An important reference in this context is Miraftab, I forgot her first name, Miraftab, who makes the distinction between invited spaces versus invented spaces of citizenship. So she looks that we on the one hand has, let's say, offers on part of the governments in order to open political decision makings to citizens, to civil society organization. But on the other hand, it's also important to look at this, what she called invented spaces of citizenship. That is that people themselves, local communities, invent new forms of political mobilization, of political action, creating their proper spaces of political action, and thus by these kind of activities are able to influence also the political process on a global scale. So the idea is what we can designate as subversive, a subversive form of governance that is basically questioning the already existing institutional order by resorting to Jacques Rancière, by those who have no part. What does this mean? By those who are not part of the traditional political process, that have not part of the wealth created by the cities and by the cities and by the societies in general. So for Rancière, the political itself only comes into being when those people that were traditionally excluded from political process and from political decision making start to question the institutional order. So this is very much in line with the idea of Miraftab, that we have to look at what happens outside institutional, the institutional realm, to look what kind of initiative with a kind of potential of transformation are emerging outside of the institutional order, and will also in fact interact with these institutional orders in order to bring into the political process their concerns and their experiences and their interests and values. So it's important when we think about the potential of transformation, what are or what could be the key actors in the urban political arena with a capacity of transformation. So therefore, I think it's interesting to look what happened in several countries. I'm looking here at the Brazilian case, where we have from the 1990s onwards, we have a tendency in Brazil of creation of new kinds of governance mechanisms to support social participation in public policies, and especially also in environmental policy. So they have been created by these governance mechanisms. We got a condition that new actors, new social actors came to enter the political spaces, and certain forms of governance have been consolidated with more involvement of social and political actors, actors that traditionally had no voice in the political process. And this has been guaranteed on the one hand by providing access, wide access to information as one precondition of effective democratic governance, and also the creation of consolidated channels for participation. By that, providing conditions, preconditions, or providing conditions for the institutionalization of social control. Several experience can be mentioned here: open forums, environmental councils, watershed management committees that are part of the water governance process. Yeah, Gilberto is okay. I hope I will finish within the time frame that you gave me. So watershed management committees, I will talk very quickly after that, public hearings, participatory budgeting, and so on. So it's a kind of incorporation of new social actors involved in resource management. And I think this is an important experience because it demonstrates the possibilities, at least, of this kind of transformation by new actors introducing in the political process. And so therefore also the question to what extent global networks could emerge for insurgent and counter-hegemonic governance practices and initiatives get a more stronger relevance also in global governance. We have some experience like the World Social Forum or climate activism, which is organized more and more globally in networks of activism that might have a relevant influence on governance issues. Well, so there are some questions I think that arise from my previous ideas. First of all, the centrality of uncertainty, risk, and complexity. So one question that arises from this diagnosis is how to avoid political paralysis in view of wicked problem. Very often we are confronted with a situation that this kind of complexity leads to paralysis instead of confronting and addressing these issues in a more effective way. The second point is the need to overcome the unequal distribution of social power and the exclusive modes of environment production. So how to put the most vulnerable, the poorest people in the cities in the first place. The second point I would say is considering that ecological crisis might imply also in other economic, political, and social, and even international crises or disasters, as I mentioned in my introduction. So are there possible paths for policy integration in the context of crisis? Then the fundamental focus of this series of lectures here: do cities become decisive agents of sustainability and resilience in view of the challenge of climate change and other wicked problems? Thinking about city networks, their importance in influence also global governance or governance in a global scale? And to what degree insurgent or subversive modes of governance can and should become integrated into global governance? We normally will look more at the potential for cities. There are several recommendations in this sense, remembering Benjamin Barber with his idea and the concept of a parliament of mayors and his insistence in the importance of mayors in global governance. But at the same time, I would like to highlight the challenge, how to insert, how to give more voice to the insurgents and subversive movements that used to appear in many of the metropolis in the global south, so that their experiences and their and these movements become an integrated element of global governance. So I come to my, I hope I have not, I'm not sure how many, what's the time left, but a very quick look on water governance in São Paulo. I gave you for previously a chapter of a book that we published recently on water governance in the context of the water crisis in São Paulo. And therefore, I would like to highlight, it's very evident that we have a kind of, that the water crisis in 2014 and 2015, it's an example for a general tendency of the huge metropolises of the planet. So water is getting more and more scarce, especially in these huge metropolises. So it's a fundamental challenge for metropolises. There are tensions and pressures on natural resources that are increasing also due to increased climate variability. And we have to face always more extreme weather events, alternating periods of heavy rain and droughts. And as a consequence, the affecting production processes and water supply for these huge metropolises, and this leading to political and socio-ecological crisis. What happened now in, sorry, I think so we could see that in the case of São Paulo, the water crisis also implied in a crisis of governance, of democracy and the state. First of all, because the government or the governor of the state of São Paulo defended or denied the existence of the crisis, basically for political electoral reasons, because he wanted to be re-elected in the following elections, was characterized by a lack of transparency, poor communication with the public. This is all what is a precondition for effective democratic governance, that you have access to the information related to the crisis, a suspension of the traditional forms of water governance based on decentralization, on participation and policy integration, as it is required also by the national legislation. It came to undermining the existing participatory watershed committees, and therefore the exclusion of civil society actors from decision making. There have been created specific governmental crisis committees, and therefore a kind of depoliticization strategy. So transferring the responsibility on water governments to basically a governmental crisis committee and withdrawing the civil society from the political process, the political decision-making process. So the crisis favored a more authoritarian and technocratic governance model in São Paulo. But on the other hand, we can see that there also have taken place movements on part of civil society confronting these authoritarian governance practices. And so we see also that what I mentioned as a form of insurgent governance, that we find some elements of these kind of of questioning of the traditional institutional practices of governance by movements that come from outside of the governments. So coming to my conclusion, I think we can see there is a kind of, we have three basic strategies that we can distinguish. On the first of all, a more consensualist approach, where the focus is on cooperation, on democratic deliberation, and also the involvement of all stakeholders as appropriate strategy for sustainable development. That seems a quite reasonable approach. However, we have to consider that, especially in the Global South, but I would say not exclusively in the Global South, due to the unequal power relation, very often in these kind of consensualist institutional arrangements, the traditional political actors, the private sector, in coalition with the government, very often is stronger and imposes its own view against civil society and against the people that are in fact affected by the policies and the governance activities. Therefore, the need for more agonistic or subversive approaches on governance, where sustainability transition or more radical social environmental changes need, in terms of Michel Foucault, permanent provocation. So permanent questioning from outside of the institutional realm by resorting to Rancière, by those who have no part, by those who are excluded, by the poor, the grassroots movements, but also by the nature, the environment. So how to integrate, how to strengthen these kind of approaches, of movements and of actors in the political process. And there is a kind of third concept, a hybrid form of meta-governance approach that starts from the assumption that there is no unique solution for governance practices in metropolis, but we need more flexible forms of governance practices, varying between more deliberative or more agonistic forms of governance in accordance with the changing conditions. So, and therefore it is important to have a more polycentric, a more variegated form of institutional arrangements in order to become more flexible, in order to come to a more resilient form of institutions that allows us to better respond to transformation, that better respond to crisis or to complex problems. So concluding, in any way, cities, but also citizens, particularly the weakest in society, depend on global governance. The decisions that are taken on a global level, they used to have influences and impacts on the local level. If we think about the role of the World Organization for Public Health in the case of the pandemic, if we think about climate change decisions that are taken in the different meetings that are taking place on a global level, the decisions taken have, or should have at least, influence the behavior and activities on the local level. Therefore, the need that these actors have a greater say in global governance. So we have to think about how a specific urban and communitarian perspective could be integrated in global governance processes. I think that something is still, it seems not so evident. However, we already experienced this recently, how movements like the Fridays for Future movement and other environmental movements try to influence processes on the scale of global governance. And I think that this is a very important movement, where some changes, potential for change at least, we can identify. So I think here are some references of the papers and work that I used for preparing my presentation. And therefore, I would thank you very much for your attention. And I hope we will have now an interesting discussion about the role of cities and the role of governance, the importance of governance, the local metropolitan governance, and its relation to global governance. Thank you very much for your attention. Yeah, I would say that the polycentric governance system already lost power to the centralized government during the crisis. So, I think it's something, it seems to me very common in crisis situation that governments used to centralize the decision-making processes with the argument that it has to be, the decisions had to be taken very quickly, and that they are of a kind of technical relevance and excluding people supposedly not capable of assessing the problems at stake. So because of their complexity and so on. And I think that is one of the major problems. I don't know if I have an answer to that. I would say it will depend on the strengths of civil society in order to confront this kind of argument and to confront this kind of practice. And I think it's also a kind of, in that case at least, it's a strong political issue where also partisan politics is at stake. So the election was a very central issue in this case, but in as much as let's say the people are and the electorate is accepting this kind of re-centralizing of political decision-making processes, it will always be a temptation for governments to resort on this more authoritarian centralized form of governance. So I don't know if there is a clear solution for this problem. I think this depends on the dynamics of the political process and the capacity of citizens and civil society to challenge this kind of tendency. I think several movements happened in this sense. For instance, that also was very important the role of the media. If the media is challenging this kind of strategy, this could change the dynamics. If it is not anymore an electoral promising strategy. So I think that's an important issue. So trying to change the game in that sense that we can bring also the people to an understanding that participation and involvement of the people is important. But in fact, participation is still limited in Brazil, and I think in many other contexts as well. I don't know if it is what is satisfactory my response. Oh, well, I'm not a specialist in water, in the more, let's say, in the system aspects of water provision and so on. I think that in general, people more from civil society, from the environmental movement, they highlight the importance of reducing water consumption as the first aspect. So we are using water in a not very economic way in general. I think that's a huge potential of reducing the problems related to water provision in general. And this was something that was basically neglected by the government. So because if you deny the existence of the water crisis, So you do not create the necessary incentives also to reduce the water use in general. However, and in that sense, I think there are many aspects related to agricultural use, for instance, of water. We are very uneconomic also in that sense. We have other experiences of other countries where we have a much more efficient irrigation systems where you need much less water. And I think we do not have this kind of approach. I would say also because it's against the let's say the Sabesp is a private company, and its interest is also to sell water and to gain on selling water, and therefore there are not the right incentives to think about these kind of approaches. I think that's one point. It's not the only point. I think there is also more technical issues that are certainly important. There I'm not really can't give you a more well technically acceptable answer for that. But I think I think it's one of the main issues here. Yeah, a complex question and many aspects that you are putting here. In fact, what we have in Brazil, especially, but I think it's not only a question of Brazil, but what we have a very strong local autonomy. So mayors used to fear more horizontal integration because they fear losing power in this process. It seems many authors, they put it that it is also related to the experience during the military regime, where the metropolitan areas have been created and had this kind of authoritarian centralizing effect, reducing the autonomy of the municipality. So there is not a recognition from mayors that by acting together in a local institutional arrangement, that they also are able to influence the transformation of the region in itself. So I think that's one problem. So from the part of on the governmental level, but on the other hand, I think that's really what you mentioned here, the question of regional citizenship, something people are living in their municipalities. It seems a little different when we look at São Paulo, for instance. People are moving. They used to live, to have their residence in one city, but they used to work, let's say, in São Paulo, or when they are living in the region of the ABC, you see that many people are living in one city, but they are working in other cities. But this is still not enough, I think, to create a kind of regional citizenship. That's related, for instance, also to the idea of a common public sphere, a public space, because it's that's also the weakness of the media. We do not have, even if on the local level, it's very difficult to get an idea of what's happening in the city hall. So it's very difficult for the citizens to accompany this. It's easier, let's say, in São Paulo, where there is also media that is accompanying what's going on in the city and the major city of the region. But we do not know much about what's happening in the other municipalities. And when you are a citizen of one of these municipalities, it's very difficult to get an idea of this. So the people are looking more on their local context. I would say there are some initiatives also from part of civil society, movements, social movements, environmental movements that are trying to act also on a regional scale. However, when we look at several arrangements, for instance, the water committees, the watershed committees, we have a difficulty to find organizations or representations of civil society that have a regional perspectives. So because they are normally only looking on the local level, and that's a very huge issue. I think it's important to increase possibilities of political participation. Looking at Germany, we have very interesting experiences, for instance, of regional parliaments very near where Glaucia is now in Tübingen. We have, for instance, Stuttgart, where you have a regional parliament where we have representatives elected by the people, directly elected, that are joining a regional parliament. And this is, I think, an interesting approach in order to stimulate also something like a regional citizenship. However, it's a huge challenge because people are living on the local, they're living in their community, and it's even difficult for them to have an idea about what happens in the municipalities. When you look at municipalities as Santo André with 600,000 inhabitants, for instance, and very different realities in the different regions and the different areas of the territory. I think that's, in fact, a huge challenge to create this kind of regional citizenship, and also regional governance is very complex to put into practice due to this to the autonomy of the municipalities and the lack of willingness also to come together in a more cooperative manner. Yeah, I think it's, I would say it's not easy to go forward with this issue. I think it happens much more related to concrete policy fields, for instance, in the field of environmental policies. So even if when we look at the city networks like C40 for climate change or the eCLAY, these are different forums and networks where we have this kind of interchange, of exchange of ideas, of concepts, and of strategies. I think that these are important. It's difficult, I think, on the regional level because you do not even have consolidated regional structures. And then how do you think about how this could happen? I think there are some that are part of these city networks. I would say that also these discussions are taking place to a certain extent, but it seems that it's still very weak, I would say. And therefore also when you look, the main actors are mayors in these kind of networks. So it's not the regional society that is involved in this process. And I would say that is also something which is quite limited in terms of global governance. So when we already have this problem, when we look at regional governance, I don't know, you are coming from different countries also, but the experience, for instance, in our region, in the ABC region, there we have a consortium of 7 municipalities, but the dynamic is basically, it's a dynamic that is driven by the mayors themselves. It started as an initiative of civil society. We had it was a committee or something of a citizen committee in the first phase of the creation of this corporation, but then by the time it has been taken over by the mayors or the administrative staff also from the municipalities, and the part of citizen involvement have been diminishing by the time. And that's something very complicated, how you can sustain participation in the long run. I think that is something many governments have handled with this problem. Because even when you are thinking of left-wing governments that in the first time focus very strongly on participation because it's an element of their political strategy, but once in power they used to neglect participation because they are involved in the daily activities of management of the governments of the city, and therefore it's very time consuming, and it's not so easy to maintain these participatory efforts during a long period of time. And it depends then on civil society itself. So the capacity to continue to be involved and to demand involvement and participation in these processes. And there are differences then, definitely, in that sense. Yeah, well, you talked about the local or the regional levels. So there is a dispute between the national and there is a dispute, I would say, between the national state and the subnational state, the states like São Paulo and so on. I think there is a kind of a conflict, and I don't know if, well, nowadays it's a conflict in public policy in general, but it's also a kind of, when we look at the global level, global governance, we see that many governors also have been at the last COP in where it was in Scotland, no, the last for climate change. So many governors here have joined the conference and tried to influence this process. I think it's much more, it's internal policy, I would say. It's politics, it's national politics when the governors go there, or even some mayors go there and try to influence this process and being part of the process. They are looking much more on the I would say on the local political system and the local political perspectives than looking at and trying to influence the global policies, I would say. And they are aware also of their very limited influence that they have, in fact, of these kind of decisions that are taken basically between the major governments that are involved in these negotiations, I would say. And yeah, I think in some cases we also see that participation have been part of the political projects of some parties. So we can say, well, the experience of participatory approaches in the municipalities in Brazil, they were not, on the one hand, definitely there was also a kind of movement from part of society that had an important influence on that, but it has been part of the political project of the Worker Party, basically, after the constitution, and this has been very important. So it was also not something that could have occurred only by involvement of civil society and so on. But this is a kind of interaction between political actors, institutional actors, and civil society actors. And I think this dynamic has to be more consistent and effective in order to promote this kind of participation. But on the regional level, definitely there is no focus on part of the governments also. That's a great problem. So that it's not, and I would say, well, as you said, we can learn maybe from other countries that these kind of intermediate structures, they might be necessary in order to come to common solutions, because in effect, in the end, it's impossible to think about the development of a metropolitan region like São Paulo and every municipality acting only looking at its own problems, because the problems, they do not respect the environmental problems, certainly do not respect jurisdictional boundaries, and therefore its need for cooperation and participation. However, it's also, I think, a kind of a challenge for state governments. State governments should have more create a role in this process, instigating this kind of cooperation. I think in the case of the ABC consortium, for instance, the role of the governor at that time was also important. It was not only the mayor of Santo André, very well known for this initiative, but also the willingness from part of the state government to favor and to support this kind of initiatives. And I think there are some things that are taking place in Brazil, for instance, also that within public policies, that there are some mechanisms that have been created in order to stimulate cooperation between municipalities. So for instance, in the field of public health, so that resources are preferentially given to municipalities that create consortiums in order to, let's say, to run a hospital or something like that. So their possibilities to get resources will increase when they are joining themselves within these kind of cooperation, like consortium, where we have a public law, a national law to foster, to incentivize this kind of cooperation. I think these are important initiatives also in order to create more regional initiatives. And yeah, to give a more positive outlook for more regional cooperation between municipalities.